I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to talk about a beautiful color from Dharma, Sea Spray. This is a beautiful green leaning blue, and it breaks. It's a lot of fun, but there's an asterisk by it for me because sometimes I see other indie dyers, especially those that dye the same colorways over again and sometimes do dyed to order, that sometimes this color behaves in a way that they weren't expecting. And so today we're gonna see if I can get it to behave a little bit differently under different conditions. Before I talk more about the project, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner, Dawn Jans. Dawn, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. I'm really excited. Now, today we are going to play around with 20-gram mini skeins of Wool to Dye For's Crazy 8 DK. This yarn is 100% superwash merino, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-soak all of this yarn for at least 30 minutes in just plain tap water with no acid. I searched back through my indie dyer forums to see if I could get a sense of when people were having issues with this color, and I found a few things. The biggest issue seems to be when you get a new batch of the dye and that the color might be leaning different from what it did before. My Sea Spray is one that I probably ordered a couple years ago, so it's an older batch. But in the last year, it's currently 2022, they have reformulated Sea Spray, and there's a note on the website right now that it leans blue. But the batch issues that people were expressing have been happening over the course of years, so I don't think it's new, and certainly not new with the company providing the asterisk. So is it that there's something that's maybe pH or temperature sensitive going on here? Or is it a batch issue? The one other time I heard people express an issue is with using dye stalks. It might be one color when it is dissolved fresh, and then another color when the dye stock's a little older, maybe something settled, and so it gave a slightly different color. There are dye colors where I have experienced something like this before. And maybe one of those is avocado, which can be very teal at first, but then towards the bottom of the cup you get this more yellow because those yellow pigments dissolve later, and so it sort of shifts within the cup, within the pores. And so we're not gonna have a dye stock that's gonna sit for weeks that I will then use on the yarn, but we can see if when we have the color mixed in a cup, if the color from the top varies from the color on the bottom. And if it turns out everything is starting to look kind of the same, well, you know what we can do? We can over dye some of these minis so that way we can create a fun fade set for our lab partner. While the yarn is pre-soaking, I put on my deluxe respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start making a dye stock of the Sea Spray acid dye for us to use today. Measuring out 2 grams of the Sea Spray and dissolving it in 200 milliliters of warm tap water. Now that we have our stock solution, I want to take about half of it and put it back in this cup over here. And then I'm gonna leave the rest in this beaker. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because we are gonna let one of them settle a little bit more than the other. I doubt it'll make a huge difference in what we're seeing today with the time scale, but some colors I do see a difference when I get towards the bottom of even a freshly made stock. So we'll see, but I'll stir this one and not this cup here. I don't know if this is coming through on camera right now, but here is some dye that I have let sit for about an hour. This one I just stirred and it's looking bluish. That one looks green, and I had let that one sit, and I have not stirred it. I just moved it back to the counter. So for our first samples, we're gonna just look at this. And now I'm either gonna take 10 milliliters of our well-stirred stock solution. Our mini skeins are 20 grams of yarn, and so we're going for a 0.5% stock solution because I'm hoping this will make some, if there are any hue differences, it'll make them a little more apparent. In cup 2, I'm going to keep the syringe very much at the top here, and without stirring, I am attempting, there we go, to get 10 milliliters of that liquid. which you can see is a different color here. Now I'm gonna stick this syringe very much on the bottom here and draw 10 milliliters of that mixture. And all of a sudden we have something that is very, very blue once again. And so I think this means that if you have your dye and you are pouring from the top or something, and maybe it was lightly shooken but not a lot, this looks like there's very little pigment in here overall. This is one big way we could have a difference in the color that we see. All right, I have not added any acid yet, and I just put 20 grams of yarn into one of our containers. Now I'm gonna add it into what was just the top of our stock solution, which gives us that more green color. That's sample 2. And then sample 3 came from the bottom of our unmixed stock solution, which is even more blue than this first one. Wow, I had a lot of ideas of things we could vary, but I think that we really found something here already. Because ultimately, each of these containers had a 1% stock solution that we mixed at the same time. The only difference is that we poured out part of it. And so we have different colors and different depths of shade, even though we added 10 milliliters of each color. I'm now going to add a teaspoon of white vinegar to each of these containers. So that'll be about 5 milliliters of vinegar total. And I want to add a little bit more liquid. And so instead of measuring, I'm just going to add water until we get to about the bottom of the threads. And this is just so that way the yarn is not going to be as compressed in the jar. We may still end up with some lovely tonal variation on each of these skeins, but we also just showed some ways that the color can look different and really, really right away, because wow. We'll be heat setting these in a little bit, but I need to just think about what else I would like to do at this point. I have examined sea spray under some varying conditions before. I tried looking to see if there would be a difference when we swatch with the dry dye powder, if it matters if the yarn starts cold or hot, because there are some colors where that does make a difference in how we see and perceive the final color. And so I was considering today, and this is why we have 10 mini skeins that are all pre-soaking, I was considering trying, okay, let's see if some of the differences come from differences in pH and temperature when we add the acid. And some of those things might make a difference in the color that we see. But I think that the biggest difference in the color that we see could be how well mixed your dye stock was. Because this isn't a stock that sat for days. This is a stock that sat maybe for an hour. And so it's still fresh, but it just shows a big reason why you want to make sure that you mix things up well. And I'll admit, I don't always, when it's fresh and made that day, I might stir a little bit, but I might not stir super vigorously or anything. I mean, I suppose the one that I stirred still stayed relatively suspended for, minutes. It's not like it takes a few seconds for things to settle and separate again. So I really wasn't expecting to have such a dramatic result so quickly. But I think that this is going to be a really good place for this project and gives us a really big answer, because even if those other variables may make a difference, this right here is one thing that you can make an effort to control by making sure it's really, really well dissolved. Or not just that, you might want to make sure that you are aliquoting the dye really soon after you first mix it up. And by that I mean, rather than making a 1 liter stock for your day of dyeing, after you mix up the stock solution, say you're going to need 200 milliliters for each batch, separate those out right away. Because then even if the dye settles, as long as that within that little batch you mix it up, you're gonna have the same amount of dye in between each batch. Whereas if it settles too much in your bottle, in your 1 liter bottle, and you pour from the top, and then later you get to the bottom and pour from the bottom, then there might be some differences that would result in different colorways. I decided it would be nice to add 2 more samples at a darker depth of shade from what we have already. So I'm gonna now use 20 milliliters for a 1% depth of shade of our stirred dye stock. And then we're gonna do 20 milliliters of the top of our unstirred dye stock. And again, I'm trying to keep the tip as close to the surface as I can while I'm doing this. Okay, and see, this is even looking more teal and less green than we had over there, probably because there is some more stirred that has happened since I started filming. I would say it's still looking fairly green overall, but maybe not as green as what we had over there. And certainly this is not as pigmented as this, which is a lot more blue. Okay, and this time here is our sample number 4, which I'm curious how similar or different this is going to look to sample number 3 over there, which feels to be more pigmented. And then here we are with sample number 5, which is looking like a completely new color, probably because it's somewhere in between there. Maybe it's got a hint more blue. But now we're going to go ahead and once again add a total of 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to the jars, and then top it off with some more liquid, and then stir in our yarn. So I would say that the color that I expect for sea spray would be like this. This green color is absolutely lovely, but is not the color that I would expect. And now that we've added the vinegar, it does feel more similar to that light one than it did before. And this, I think, is just looking more blue overall, but we do need to heat set things still. And now here are our 5 colors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 and 4 are our mixed 1% stock solution. 2 and 5 came from the top, and then 3 came from the bottom of the unmixed. And we have a lot of different colors here. Now to heat set things, I'm gonna put these jars inside a pasta insert in a pot, so that way we can steam it. I'm gonna fill this up so that way the water level will be just below the surface of the jars, and put it on my stove and start heating things up. Done. I'm surprised I was able to get such dramatic results on purpose. I am still really, really amazed. Now, could there be some effects based on whether you're starting hot and cold and things like that? Yes, there are potential that there's ways that the different pigments, and we know this color breaks with speckling, but there could be differences in the way that those colors dissolve, and which one dissolves maybe faster than the other. And so the order that you add things together into a pot could make a difference. But I'm not going to investigate those today because we got really dramatic results just from one variable at the beginning. And honestly, stirring up the dye stock before you measure things out is a variable that comes into play for every video, so much that, yeah, that is probably the thing, in my opinion, that could make the biggest difference for seeing a different color right off the bat, especially if you're considering the differences here, where these are samples 3 and 4, And they are very close, but 3 is definitely more blue and 4 is definitely more green. I don't know if that's showing up as well on camera, but also this one, 4 had double the amount of dye added. So the total depth of shade and everything can make a difference if it's an older stock and you're near the bottom. But anyway, we will see if we see any other differences once things have heated up and we've allowed the dye baths to clear. I mean, right now, I would even say most of the color without adding heat is already in the yarn. These colors are striking really, really quickly. So I will be back later. And we're gonna want everything to heat for at least 30 minutes. And given our double boiler kind of situation here, it'll take a little longer to heat things up. So I will cover the pot with a lid. While we wait for Dawn's yarn to finish heat setting, I thought it would be fun to do just one other little experiment. Very crude because this is an old dye bath that could in theory have a hint of purple, but doesn't seem to have a hint of purple. It has a lot of vinegar in it, and it is not hot anymore, but it is still warm because I used this from another video. I am just submerging 100 grams of Knit Picks Swish DK yarn in here. And now I am gonna come and pour on our sea spray. This is the one that was not mixed. And I'm gonna pour it. Oh look, here's where it changed from more green to more blue. Check that out. The top was very green, the middle was more sea spray, and the bottom is very, very blue. This is broken. The color has broken, and we may not see these differences in hues on the finished yarn because we have a lot of water in here, but you know, the difference in what we've seen, the top, middle, and bottom pour, and how there's so much more pigment on that bottom pour, and so much less on the top, I think is really, really interesting. I'm gonna do my best to not touch the yarn as much as possible, but I am gonna be adding more color and it'll kind of ruin this little gradient we have going on. But actually, maybe instead what I'll do, before I ruin it, is let's just apply heat for 5 minutes and then we'll see what things look like, just out of curiosity. All right, it's been 5 minutes. The blues have spread, but there are no question tonal differences in here. So I'm now gonna come in with the rest of the dye I have. I wonder if a lot of this breaking will be visible on the finished yarn or not. But here is our mixed sea spray, which actually has sat a little bit, so maybe is a little less mixed than that was, and we're gonna let that spread. And here is a little bit of the bottom, also just sort of present. Ooh, it almost looks like there are some speckles that have come out of one of these stalks. So maybe some undissolved powder. But anyway, there is a chance that this will come out being more consistent in color since the dyes are able to spread and therefore mix here in the dye bath. But I think that that first pour did show that when you're pouring your dyes, if they're not well mixed, some colors, that can make a difference with the color we see. So anyway, I'm gonna let this heat for 30 minutes and then we will come back. It has been 30 minutes and everything in here is nice and steamy. We are seeing some bubbles towards the center. And let's look at 4, which was our most pigmented. Yeah, and I'm not seeing any other color in the water, but we also didn't see that earlier. So what I am going to do now is turn off the heat, and I'm gonna leave things in here for a while to cool off, just because that's what my schedule allows today. But otherwise, if I didn't need to do that, I could remove the insert so that way things would cool off a lot faster. It has been 30 minutes and I'm curious how much this will show up when it's dry, but I do see more blue and more green patches, and our dye bath is clear. I am gonna leave this in here to finish cooling off, And once things are cool, then we will wash all of our yarn. I have just stuck the pasta insert inside my wash bath so I can look and see, yep, all that water is clear and we can wash this. And so I would say that we have some really, really subtle differences. And if I rearrange their order a bit, yeah, these three over here are pretty close. Maybe I would put this one over there, even though it's more green than blue. And we do have a fun set that does have all different colors. I'm also gonna bring over this Leave No Dye Behind skein, and I'm not sure how much the camera's picking it up, but we absolutely have bluer and greener sections on here. The color is very, very broken, and so I'm really excited we were able to capture that with our pours. But anyway, I am now going to add a little bit of some clear dish soap to our rinse bath. I just always like to be able to show how well, hopefully, our colors have struck through the yarn. Yep, it's looking great. I'm not seeing any bleeding. So what I'm going to do now is rinse out the soap, put the yarn in my spin dryer to remove some of the excess water, and then I will hang it up to dry. Oh my goodness, Dawn. Here are 5 different colors that we created with the same stock solution of Dharma Trading Company's Sea Breeze Acid Dye, just depending on how well mixed it was. For our first 3 colors, we aimed for a 0.5% depth of shade, which would be half of a gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. And we did this by taking 10 milliliters of our, quote, 1% stock solution and using that to dye 20 grams of yarn. And so when we had our stock solution mixed, we got the color that is sea spray. I think that that is the color that we would have expected. But if we let the dye sit for even 30 minutes without stirring, and then just took some liquid from the top of the cup, we got this beautiful, minty pistachio leaning green. That is definitely less pigmented than the first sample. And then similarly, if we drew up those 10 milliliters from the bottom of the non-stirred cup, we ended up with a color that is both more blue and more saturated than our original color. And so here we have something that really can show how the color can sometimes appear more green, sometimes appear more blue. I think it depends on how much you've mixed your stock solution. And for comparison's sake of the more blue, here is a 1% stock solution of the stirred dye. So here we have double the amount of dye that we did in our first sample, but it was all mixed together versus just from the bottom. And I don't know how well this is going to come through on camera, but in person, this I would call a blue, and this I would call more of a teal. Overall, I think Sea Spray does lean a little bit more blue than green, but there's no question that these are different colors. Sometimes twisting yarn together can really help you start to see those differences between the more blue and the more green areas. This is a trick that I learned when I was dyeing some of my own yarn for a knit-along, which actually will be a project that in the coming months I hope to be sharing more of here. But if you want to make sure that there's a good amount of contrast between 2 colors, twist them together. And if you can easily see the difference, then there's enough contrast. Now, this would be an example of not enough contrast between the 2 colors for wanting some kind of colorwork design to show up. That being said, there is a difference between them, and I think that you should be able to see that. I do think that it's interesting that the contrast between these 2 colors, where we used 20 milliliters of dye here, 10 milliliters there, the contrast is smaller there than between either of them and the 0.5% depth of shade that we dyed very first. The last sample was from taking 20 milliliters of the dye that was just at the top of a non-stirred container. And this green is definitely deeper than the first one. We do see a shift in the depth of shade, but I would say that this is not as deep as any of the others where we had either the bottom or a little more mixed. So what's the big deal about this? What can we learn? Why is understanding that you want things to be well mixed important? Well, this is one of the more extreme examples of how not having something well mixed can lead to color differences. There are other colors like avocado and maybe sage leaf that also maybe do some similar things. So this is not the only color that does it. But this can come into play if you're going to do any kind of dyeing with something that may involve some pouring. And that becomes a lot more obvious here, where we have this tonal colorway that we created by pouring the dyes in. But we have areas that are more green and areas that are more blue. Yes, some of it is because we used some of the dye to create Dawn's minis. But some of this is also just from the fact that if things weren't mixed up, then we got almost a gradient with our pours. And this is something that I think came up last year during Hanukkah when I was dyeing a colorway and some felt more pigmented than others when I was using the same proportions of dye in each batch. I believe Sea Spray was one of the colors I used, and if I was measuring out dye from something that wasn't well mixed, then that really could explain the pigment difference I was seeing, because it would then depend a lot on if I had something that was from the bottom, from the top, or well mixed in terms of not just the hue, but the pigmentation. And so if I started with one dye stock that was older, this could have made a difference in some of the color differences I observed. But now on to the fun part. How would I arrange this into a set? I think we'd start with the lightest, get a little darker, and probably like that. I mean, this color here is definitely the most pigmented, so we could put this blue in between, even though color-wise, hue-wise, maybe that doesn't quite fit. So Dawn, it's definitely up to you how you want to play with them and play with them together. But this might be one of the ways that I would do it. Of course, I think it would also be fun, you know, to mix together in stripes or something like that as well. There's a lot of different things that you could do. But Dawn, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Sea Spray, and I'm really excited to play with this color more, especially because I feel like I know more now, and I know more how to get something like this on purpose, or how to not get something like this. Maybe. Maybe I can control it. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I always post at least twice a week, and it's a lot of fun. I love both more, I don't know if this is technical. I mean, there was a little bit of math, but I like playing around with things and trying to see how reproducible things can be sometimes. And so this is making me want to go back and see if I can reproduce some things that I've done in the past and how close I feel it is. If that's something you would like to see, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to know some other ways to help support the content here, there's always tons of links down in the video description that you can check out. But go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. It's a really great platform. Patrons get early access to the Dyepot PS series, and there's lots of other fun perks. I'll have a link to the Patreon down in the video description. Or you can go to patreon.com/ChemKnits. Thank you so much for watching.